The cell door slammed shut with a hard metal sound that echoed down the hallway. Inside that small room in HMP Belmarsh, London, UK, two men stood just a few feet apart. One of them was Sundeep Ghuman, a British Asian inmate who did not know that this would be the last place he would ever stand alive. The other man was his cellmate, a prisoner already known by staff for racist behavior and violent thoughts. Hours later, officers would rush to that same cell. Hours later, Sundeep Ghuman would be found dead. This was not a fight that broke out by accident. This was not bad luck. This was the end result of a decision that should never have been made, a decision that would later force the prison system to answer hard questions and lead to an official prevention of future deaths report. But how did two men who should never have shared a cell end up locked together inside one of Britain's most feared prisons? And why were the warning signs missed? Before the reports, before the outrage, before the headlines, it all began much earlier, quietly, slowly, and almost unnoticed. Let's go back. HMP Belmarsh sits in southeast London. From the outside, it looks cold and heavy, like a concrete fortress. Tall fences, razor wire, watchtowers. People in the UK call it Britain's Guantanamo, not because of what it looks like, but because of who is held inside. Terror suspects. Violent offenders. Men considered dangerous or hard to control. Inside, life moves on a strict routine. Doors open. Doors close. Keys jangle. Officers count heads again and again. Every movement is logged. Every mistake can cost a life. Sundeep Ghuman was not famous. He was not powerful. He was just one inmate among hundreds. But he was also someone who needed protection. Sundeep was British Asian. That mattered inside prison. Prison walls do not stop racism. In some places, they make it worse. Words are whispered. Looks are exchanged. Threats are made quietly, so quietly they sometimes never reach the ears of staff. Sundeep had raised concerns before. He had spoken about feeling unsafe. He had warned about tension with other inmates. In prison, when someone says they feel unsafe, it is supposed to trigger action. Officers are trained to assess risk. They ask questions. They look at history. They decide who should be kept apart. This process is called a risk assessment. On paper, it is meant to save lives. But paper does not feel fear. And paper does not hear hate in a man's voice. The prison was busy that day. Cells needed to be filled. Inmates were being moved around. Staff were under pressure. Decisions were made quickly. Somewhere in that process, a fatal mistake happened. Sundeep was assigned a cellmate. That cellmate already had a record of racist behavior. He had made comments before. He had shown anger toward people of different backgrounds. This information existed. It was written down. It was known. Yet the system failed to connect the dots. To the prison records, it was just another pairing. To Sundeep, it was a silent danger. The cell they shared was small. 2 beds. A toilet. Bare walls. No place to hide. No place to run. When the door closed, there would be no officer inside, no camera watching every move. Just 2 men and hours of lock time. At first, nothing happened. That is often how prison violence begins. Quiet. Heavy silence. Each man watching the other. Measuring. Waiting. Sundeep tried to keep to himself. He stayed on his side of the cell. He followed the rules. He did not cause trouble. But tension does not need noise to grow. Words were said. Not shouted. Whispered. Sharp words filled with hate. The kind of words that cut deeper than fists. The kind of words that make your heart race even when your body stays still. Sundeep felt it. Fear in prison is different from fear outside. There is no escape. No calling for help without consequences. No safe place to calm down. Every minute stretches longer than the last. Outside the cell, officers continued their rounds. Doors opened and closed along the wing. Keys turned. Radios crackled. Everything looked normal. Inside the cell, it was not. Sundeep knew something was wrong. But knowing is not the same as being able to stop it. Time passed. Then, violence came. Not loud. Not dramatic. Fast. Brutal. Final. When officers eventually unlocked the door, it was too late. Sundeep Ghuman was dead inside his prison cell. The news spread fast through the wing. Prisoners talked. Officers talked. Questions began almost immediately. How could this happen? Why were these two men placed together? Who signed off on the decision? For Sundeep's family, the pain was unbearable. They were told their loved one had died in custody, under the care of the state. A place that was supposed to keep him safe had failed in the worst possible way. Outside the prison, public anger began to grow. Advocacy groups spoke out. Lawyers demanded answers. This was not just a tragedy, it was a warning. An investigation was launched. The risk assessment process came under a microscope. Every form, every note, every decision. Officials had to explain how a known racist inmate was allowed to share a cell with a man who had already expressed fear for his safety. The findings were deeply troubling. The system had gaps. Warnings were not properly shared. Information was missed. Procedures were followed on paper, but not in spirit. As a result, a prevention of future deaths report was issued. Its purpose was clear: this must never happen again. But for Sundeep Ghuman, those changes came too late. And for the prison staff involved, the pressure was just beginning. Because one question still hung in the air, heavier than all the others. Who was responsible for the decision that locked that cell door? That answer would reveal a chain of failures stretching far beyond one prison cell, and it all began with the moment an officer checked a box, turned a key, and walked away, leaving Sundeep Ghuman alone with the man who would kill him.
After Sundeep Ghuman died, the prison did not stop. That is one of the hardest truths about places like HMP Belmarsh. Even when a man dies inside a cell, the doors still open and close. Meals are still served. Counts are still done. Life inside keeps moving, even when a life has ended. But something had changed. The wing felt different. Prisoners whispered more than usual. Officers spoke in lower voices. Everyone knew something terrible had happened, even before the full details were shared. Sundeep's cell was sealed off. Tape went up. Senior officers arrived. Then investigators. They walked slowly, taking notes, looking at the floor, the walls, the beds. They treated the cell like a crime scene, because that is exactly what it was. Outside the prison walls, Sundeep's family received the call no family ever wants to get. Their son was dead. No long explanation. No comfort that could truly help. Just the cold truth that he had died in custody. Under government care. In a place that promised safety, not danger. For them, time stopped. For the prison system, time moved forward into damage control. The first question officials asked was simple but frightening. Was this preventable? To answer that, they had to go backward. They reviewed Sundeep's prison file. Page by page. They read his intake forms. His behavior reports. His requests. His warnings. And there it was. Notes showing that Sundeep had felt unsafe. Notes showing tension. Notes that should have raised red flags. Then they reviewed the other inmates' file. Racist comments. Aggressive behavior. A pattern that did not appear overnight. This was not hidden information. It existed. It was documented. So how did these two files never meet in a meaningful way? The answer pointed to the risk assessment system. In prison, risk assessments are supposed to act like shields. They protect inmates from known threats. They guide staff when making housing decisions. They are not optional. They are critical. But at HMP Belmarsh, on that day, the system failed. Staff were stretched thin. The prison was crowded. Officers were managing too many inmates with too little time. Decisions that needed care were made quickly. One form. One signature. One unchecked warning. That was all it took. The officer who approved the cell placement did not wake up that day planning for someone to die. But intention does not erase consequence. Inside the prison, rumors spread fast. Some inmates said Sundeep had begged not to be placed with that cellmate. Others said officers had brushed off concerns. No one knew which stories were true, but fear feeds on uncertainty. For prisoners who already felt vulnerable, Sundeep's death sent a clear message. If it happened to him, it could happen to me. Tensions rose. Officers increased patrols. They watched for fights. They tried to calm nerves. But trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. Meanwhile, outside the prison, pressure was growing. Advocacy groups demanded transparency. Lawyers representing Sundeep's family demanded answers. The media began asking uncomfortable questions about racism inside British prisons. Was this just one tragic mistake? Or was it part of a larger problem? An official investigation moved forward. Witnesses were interviewed. Staff members were questioned. Every decision leading up to the cell placement was examined. And then came the coroner. The coroner's role is not to punish, but to understand. To say how someone died, and whether that death could have been avoided. In Sundeep Ghuman's case, the findings were clear and damning. The death was linked directly to a failure in risk assessment. A man with known racist behavior should never have been placed in a cell with a British Asian inmate who had expressed fear. That sentence changed everything. Because it meant the system, not just an individual, was responsible. As a result, a prevention of future deaths report was issued. This kind of report is serious. It is a public warning. It tells authorities that unless changes are made, more people could die in the same way. The report listed failures. Missed warnings. Poor communication. Lack of proper safeguards. It called for reform. But reform is slow. And prisons are places where slow change can be deadly. Inside HMP Belmarsh, the staff felt the weight of scrutiny. Every decision was now questioned. Every mistake felt heavier than before. Some officers felt blamed. Others felt guilty. A few felt angry. But none could undo what had happened. Sundeep Ghuman was still gone. Then, just as the prison tried to regain control, another problem surfaced. Investigators uncovered evidence that this was not the first time concerns about racist violence had been raised at the prison. There were earlier warnings. Earlier near misses. Earlier chances to act. They had all been ignored. And as that truth came into focus, a new fear emerged. One that shook both the prison staff and the public. If this system had failed once, how many other inmates were still in danger right now? Because somewhere inside HMP Belmarsh, other cell doors were still closing. And another deadly mistake could already be in motion. The fear did not stay quiet for long. After the investigation findings became public, the pressure on the prison system grew heavy. Politicians asked questions. Officials gave careful answers. Every word was chosen to avoid blame, but blame was already there, sitting in plain sight. Inside HMP Belmarsh, change began, but slowly. Officers were told to review cell placements again. Risk assessments were rechecked. Files were reread. Some inmates were moved. Others were separated. On the surface, it looked like action. But for Sundeep Ghuman's family, none of it felt like justice. They wanted to know one thing. How did the system allow this to happen? They attended hearings. They listened as prison officials explained procedures. They heard phrases like human error and systemic failure. To them, those words sounded empty. Because behind every policy mistake was a real person who had died alone in a locked cell. The coroner's conclusions were read aloud. The prevention of future deaths report was discussed line by line. It warned that without real change, more deaths could happen the same way. The message was clear. This was not just about Sundeep. It was about everyone still inside. The report pushed for better communication between staff. Clearer warning systems. Stronger protection for inmates who felt unsafe. Special attention to racial tension and hate-based threats. On paper, the future looked safer. But prisons do not change overnight. Inside Belmarsh, inmates watched closely. Some felt relief. Others felt nothing at all. They had seen promises before. Officers were trained again. New rules were explained. Meetings were held. Yet the walls stayed the same. The cells stayed the same. And fear still lived in quiet corners. Sundeep's name became part of prison history. A reminder. A warning. Not spoken loudly, but remembered. His family continued to speak out. They did not want revenge. They wanted accountability. They wanted to know that no other family would get the same phone call they did. Slowly, the story reached beyond the UK. People in the United States and around the world paid attention. They saw a familiar pattern, systems built to protect failing the people inside them. A single decision. A missed warning. A life lost. In the end, no one could bring Sundeep Ghuman back. But his death forced the prison system to look at itself in a way it could no longer avoid. Every time a cell door closes now, his story lingers. A question that cannot be ignored. Is this placement truly safe? Or is another tragedy waiting behind locked steel and silent walls? Because as long as prisons exist, the line between order and disaster remains thin. And Sundeep Ghuman's story proves just how deadly that line can be.